open source as well now. So this is part of the conversation we would like to get you guys involved with and working with us on, and you are always welcome to join RCOS. RCOS is intended to be multidisciplinary. Having you guys there actually makes our course better. So getting the diverse experiences and disciplines. Where am I going to go with this? Well, it turns out that this is the catchiest slide, and then we're going to tell you that this is going to be a little bit of a journey. Because we're going to start off way at the front, right? What intellectual property is and what it means for us to make something open source. Concepts of free and open source software that apply right down to the software that we develop. A lot of the software I developed, even for commercial products and for commercial companies, was actually released open source. Because it turns out that making money off of open source is encouraged and allowed. And, you know, this is a little bit flippant, but Red Hat had a career, the company, all they did was package up and support free software. And IBM bought them for $4 billion, I think, 5 years ago, give or take. So there's big money in open source. If you do it right, you just got to think about it. So we're going to get into that. The reason we have to do that is because, you know, open source isn't just making your source available. There's some philosophy behind it and some philosophy that guides what it means to be truly open source. So we have to understand what it means to be open source in order to figure out what's wrong with AI and what we have to do to actually make that open source as well. So it's going to be a little bit of a journey. I want to throw out that, emphasize the fact that up until October of last year, there were no standards. There were 3 standards published from October 9th until the end of the year in 2024. They've entered a stable phase, so I don't expect anything for the next couple of months, although I did furiously check this morning to make sure I didn't miss a new release. So we are talking on, you know, we are the front edge of this. You guys are going to know what's going on, and your opinions will count. And if you get in touch with the people who are developing these standards, they do their software development or their standards development in the open. So there is room for people to talk, to read, to consider, and to contribute. All right, so let's talk about intellectual property. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but it's really important that we understand exactly what intellectual property is if we're going to understand what open source is, right? So broadly, intellectual property is something you make up in your mind that has some value to somebody, okay? And it tends to be, for our purposes, it can be copyright material, literary, artistic works, in ideational property. It can be property such as patents, which are actual things you reduce to practice. And by the way, that includes software. Software can be patented, but it's generally patented as a business process, which sounds weird, but that's how it goes in. You can't actually patent the written word, you can copyright it. And then there's things like trademarks and trade secrets, which are a little bit different but still fall under intellectual property. The first 3 don't really matter. Trade secrets, that's just, right, Coca-Cola's secret formula, the 11 herbs and spices, your special recipe, your special business process that allows you to make, you know, your product so much better than everybody else's. You know, curing times for rosins or epoxies, or, you know, all these different things that you do that nobody else knows how to do, and you protect just by not telling them. They're fragile. As soon as somebody figures it out, they can use it. They can rediscover it, right? If you go online and Google Coca-Cola secret formula or, you know, the 11 herbs and spices for Kentucky Fried Chicken, you can get experts who have pretty good opinions on what that actually means, and you can get pretty close, right? Trade secrets are fragile. Trademark, that's not fragile at all. The Nike Swish is a trademark. When you see that, what do you think about, right? Sneakers. Just in case nobody wears Vans, they're sneakers. You know, I'm going to throw out that the oldest continuous trademark, the one that's still in use today, anybody have any idea what that is? Yes?
Harvard?
Harvard? No. guessed that, kind of.
I don't know why we're doing it.
Yeah, it's Bass Ale. Have you guys ever had Bass Ale? It's an import from United Kingdom. It appears in some of the old masters paintings, Rembrandt and others. I think it's Rembrandt has bottles of Bass Ale on the table when some of the revelers are drinking. It's the oldest continuous trademark in use today. I don't know why I find that fascinating, but if anything can last 200 years, apparently it's beer. I don't think it's the same thing. Patent is an exclusive right to use, monopolize an idea for a specific period of time in exchange for disclosing it. What this typically means, or what this means in practice, is you tell everybody exactly how you're going to do it so that somebody skilled in the art, and that's an actual term, skilled in the art, can reproduce whatever it is you're patenting following your instructions. So it has to be complete, it has to be novel, it can't be something that was already created before, and you have to disclose it well enough that somebody else can jump on it. And in order, in reward for doing that, what they do is they give you a monopoly over it for generally about 20 years, give or take, right? So that means that you exclusively can do that, you make it, or you can license it out to other people to make. Once that patent expires, you get things like generic drugs based on the formula for the patented drug that's expired, generally available a lot cheaper, etc. Right? So the idea there is you patent something and you then can exclusively use it, exclusively decide who gets to use it for a period of time, so you can make billions of dollars and then the price drops out of the volume. Anybody know what this particular patent is? That's a drawing from an actual patent that you may be concerned about at some point in your lives. That is it. Yeah.
It looks like it might be part of a football mouse.
What kind of mouse?
A mouse that has a ball.
Right, mechanical mouse. Yeah, so that is exactly what that is. That is part of the drawing from a mechanical mouse when it was first patented. Okay? So that's kind of cool. And all of these kind of interact with open source software in some ways and forms. Normally, when you open source your software, you don't make your trademark available. You may or may not exclude patents. But we don't really care about them too much because that's just on the periphery. What we really care about is copyright. How many of you have written code? Hopefully everyone, right? At some point. Do you know you created a work of art? Right? Code is a work of art. And it's protected, like all great works of art, under copyright. So copyright is legal right granted to somebody, you, to exclusive publication, production, sale, or distribution of something, right? And we're going to ignore literary, musical, dramatic. We're just going to go on artistic work. A program, a computer program falls under artistic work, okay? Now, the thing about a copyright is a copyright protects an expression of an idea. It doesn't protect the idea itself. So a patent protects an idea or an implement, right? So a patent gives you exclusive right to keep anybody from doing what you're doing. A copyright says, I wrote this, and my specific expression of it is protected. But if somebody who comes in, right, and develops something that does the same thing using their own code, that's a different expression. So you're never protecting with copyright. You're never stopping anybody else from doing what you're doing. You're stopping them from using your specific implementation. Okay? Make sense? Now, the cool thing about copyright is you have to register a trademark. Trade secrets you need to save. Patent you have to register. A copyright is given to you by the act of creation. You may have to prove you're the person that wrote it, but the act of doing it generates the copyright. You don't have to do anything else, right? When you create something, you've created the copyright. And just like any other copyright, any other work of art, having expressed this beautiful artistic work in code means that you have the authority to say how other people can use your code. That's the basis of open source licenses. Because free and open source licenses are simply you telling other people what they can do with your code. You're giving them explicit permission. Okay, so when you put an open source license on something, all you're doing is you're telling them what they can do, how they can use your stuff, and the limits of their ability to take your expression of some idea and leverage it. All right? First part's over. There we sit. Now with the chip. All right. So, and by the way, in the spirit of open source, I stole these next couple of pages from a good friend of mine, Patrick Nissan. He was the head of the OSI for a number of years, and now he's a member of Apereo, which I was also on the board of for a while because he got me into it. But there's generally two worlds of copyright, of open source licensing. The first is what they call copyleft, right? So generally with a copyleft license, what you're saying is that anybody is free to take your code and use it. They can modify it all they want, they can do whatever they want with it, but if they distribute it, if they give it to somebody else, external to their company or whatever, if they do that act of distribution, the stuff they're distributing is under the same license as the stuff they use to create. Okay? So that's copyleft. That's sometimes called viral because it infects other code. But I don't think they like being called viral. It's still a very descriptive way of talking about it. On the other side of it is something called a permissive license. And a permissive license says, I wrote this thing, it's really great, you can use it, you can do whatever you want with it, including not making it open source if you distribute your own product with it. The only thing you have to do is you have to give me credit for what I did, right? So you have to give me credit in the code itself saying this was derived from code by Wes Turner or whomever you happen to be, use a different name. And you can't blame me for the things you added that was wrong. Okay, so it's a flip a coin. Give me credit, don't blame me for what you did. You can take permissive code, you can pull it inside, you can make a proprietary product out of it, and as long as the little about box you click on, or the user's manual, when you get your VCR out, says this product uses code from, and lists your copyright, you're perfectly within your rights, right? So there's nothing stopping you from taking permissive licensed code and generating whatever you want from it. So here's a couple of examples. In general, copyleft code, the viral code, that's your GPL license. That's your Apereo GPL license. Right, one is local to your computer. The GPL, Apereo is server systems. It just basically defines when that distribution happens. Apereo is if somebody logs into a machine, you let somebody else log into a machine, run, and use your code. That's a distribution. That's not the same thing for a GPL. You actually have to do it. All right? And that just says if you use GPL code in your product and you distribute it, then the code you generated is also distributed under the GPL. All that means. Permissive code, on the other hand, is like Apache, BSD, MIT. Like I said, that's generally give me credit for what I did. Don't blame me for what you did, and we'll all be fine. There's also something in the middle called lesser, things like the LGPL, Mozilla MPL, which kind of fall in between. The rules on using them are a little bit looser, but if you cross the line, you cross the line, and your code needs to be licensed appropriately. And then there's the whole public domain thing, which we're not going to talk about so much here because that's a whole other discussion and would add another 10 minutes. So we're going to avoid it. And just because I think most of you are IEEE people, so you're probably not software people, you don't care about the GPL, there are actually 3 hardware licenses as well: CERN, OHL, S for strict, CERN, OHL, W for weak. Those are, copyleft and lesser copyleft licenses. and then CERN OHLP 2.0, which is a hardware copyright that's very good. Okay, so these exist in hardware. This is a great accomplishment from my standpoint because this means when I have double A's or other majors coming in to RCOS, I now have something I can point them at. Before we were just kind of making do with Creative Commons and some other ways of making sure that our code remained, the stuff they generated remained useful. All right, so I needed to get that out because as I'm going through this, I'm going to talk about classes of licenses, and I want to make sure that when I say a license, at least you've seen it before on the slide. So we're almost past the way to get it. Free software was generally coined, it was coined by Richard Stallman. You guys are familiar with him? He's spoken on campus at least twice that I'm aware of. He is, by all indications, a character. Fun character, kind of servant. But there's a story that goes behind this. And I think it's true, at least at its root. It may be a little bit apocryphal right now. But the story goes that Richard Stallman worked at MIT, in the MIT lab. That's true. And they had a Xerox printer. And this is in the good old days, or the bad old days, however you want to think about it, when we didn't sell software, right? There wasn't a software industry. There was selling iron, printers, machines. And you couldn't use the machines without this little nuisance thing, firmware that had to be installed on. Nobody made money off the software. They made money off of selling iron printers. So MIT bought a printer. They got drivers for it. They got all the source code because Xerox didn't care. And Stallman and his mates got used to taking that code, changing it, and recompiling it to make that printer print however they wanted. And I don't know exactly what they were doing. It was an MIT lab. They had, good ideas and some bad ideas. They would make the printer do whatever they wanted. And that went on for a long time. And they got really used to that. And that's how they started thinking software was. And then the printer broke. And they got a new printer. And time has marched on. Now people are selling software, and software is part of the competitive advantage. So even if they're not selling it, right, they don't want you taking the software and giving it to somebody else, or using it, or changing it, because if you break the printer, then you're going to void the warranty, all sorts of stuff. So they wouldn't give them the software. And this floored and offended him, and by all accounts was easily offended. I think that's generally accepted. So it got him thinking about why he was offended, and that led to, in some long drawn out path, that led to these freedoms, right? So you're approaching this from the standpoint of, think about freedom as of computer programs as information transfer, right? A mathematical formula, right? And there's a case that could be made that, right, all computer programs are just mathematical formulas.
Well, how can you not share mathematical formulas, right? It doesn't even make sense, right? Math is math. It's a description of the world in some kind of symbolic form. So it doesn't make sense not to share it. So therefore, it should be free, and everybody should have access. So if you read these rules with that kind of in the back of your mind as the impetus for it all kind of makes sense. So the first one says, free software, the first freedom, and by the way, he was a programmer, so we start with 0 instead of 1, right? The first freedom, freedom 0, you gave me some code, I now have the magic mathematical formula, I can do with it whatever I want. I can run it anywhere I want for whatever purpose. You've given it to me, I own it, you don't have the right to tell me how to use it, okay? Data is free. Information wants to be free. It yearns to be free, right? So I get to use it. I get to put it however I want. Okay? That's the first one. Freedom 1 says, well, you know, I really should be able to change that formula because I don't like some of the terms. So I'm going to change some of the formulas to do what I want them to do. Right? So that's freedom one, the second freedom, the freedom to change the program that you own. And in order to do that, right, have any of you, do we still teach binary anymore? I think we teach assembly. We have Professor Kuzman over on the side. Have you ever tried to modify stuff looking at binary? It's painful. And if you don't have the source, so you can at least find out where the assembly goes, it's really painful. So in order to effectively have freedom one, you need access to the source. There's no way you can, in a practical sense, have freedom number one, the second freedom, without having access to the source code, right? And remember, data wants to be free, so that's just a mathematical expression anyway, right? Bob's your uncle. By the way, have any of you ever read one of the Microsoft Oilas, at least one of the old ones? As a kind of pushback against this, you don't ever buy the code. You rent the code from them, right? If you ever read to the end of that thing, they're not giving you anything. They're leasing the code to you as long as you don't break their rules. But anyway, freedom two, the third freedom, is, well, it's a mathematical formula. Data wants to be free. I have the right to share the mathematical formula you gave me with any of my friends or even people I don't like. You know, if it's a bad program, I'll give it to people I don't like, and we'll get them engaged with it as well. And then freedom three, the fourth and final freedom, is you have the right to distribute your modifications as well. Okay, so that's the whole backbone of the origination of the free software movement. And you know, you can kind of see there, freedoms 1 and 3 require that you have the source code available to you. If you don't have the source code, 1 and 3 become very difficult to accomplish. Okay, so that's going on good, and that's kind of the source of the original copyleft licenses, right? GPL is exactly this. You know, and again, if you're thinking about this from a philosophical standpoint, that information wants to be free, well, you can see why, if you take my code, you have to subscribe to my philosophy is not such a far step to take, right? You've benefited from my philosophy, now you have to return the favor by making your code free as well. The problem is that isn't all that enticing to a business that's trying to make money off of trade secrets embedded in code, right? So after a while of this free software movement, some adherents, some people who read, you know, Eric Raymond wrote, I think it's The Bazaar and the Cathedral, very good book if you ever want to read about software design and iterative processes and how to make good software. But he and some friends were sitting around, probably having some Bass Ale because they were in a bar, and they started thinking that, well, this whole GPL thing, this viral nature of the GPL is causing us some problems, and it's kind of contaminated the free software. We have to keep telling people free software is free as in speech, not free as in beer. You know, you can actually sell and make money off of free software, as weird as that sounds. It's, like I said, Red Hat, $4 billion off of free software. Let's coin something else, and let's stop being viral. Let's allow anybody to take our code, because we're not going to win by getting people not to use our code by making it viral. The way we're going to win is we're going to win by having everybody take our code. If everybody's using our code, we have an enormous amount of leverage. So they changed it. And they said, we still accept free software. It's still a very good thing, but there are other ways you can release code that is open instead of just free. So they came up, you know, Richard Stallman was a philosopher. He came up with 4 rules. These are engineers. 10 rules. Okay, so we're growing. But they came up with 10 rules that essentially encapsulate the 4 freedoms and, importantly, are actually measurable. So you can look at these and you can say, does this software abide by this rule, right? So you can see what's actually going on. You don't have to have this nebulous four freedoms that, could be argued. They're relatively straightforward, but this is, much more checkmark engineer-like. And, you're not going to be surprised by these. Free redistribution, right? If you give me free software or open software, I can give it away. And that's the way it is. And it doesn't matter if it's a component of a whole bunch of software that you're giving me on the same disk or the same suite of programs or not. It applies only to the software, and there's no requirement for a royalty or fee. You give it away. You have that right having received the software. It has to contain the source code, right? And it has to contain the source code in a way that it can be actually used and understood. I must be able to make derived works, right? That's number 3. You have to allow modifications, and it must allow them to be distributed under the same terms as the license of the original software. That handles the viral case. Must allow them to be redistributed under the terms of the original software. Notice it doesn't say can't be redistributed other ways. At a minimum, you have to allow GPL to be redistributed GPL. Integrity of the author's source code, that's give me credit, don't blame me. No discrimination against persons or groups. That actually turns out to be that one in number 6, no discrimination against fields of endeavor, is actually one of the controversial ones now. But the idea here is they want something measurable that's objective and can't change. So if you say no evil people, right, and you change the definition of what an evil person is, what happens to the code? And how do you enforce that? And how is that something that can be enforced? The easy way around it is just no discrimination, right? You can't discriminate against, anybody, and you can't discriminate against any field of endeavor. So if you don't believe in nuclear power and you don't want your software used in a nuclear power plant, you can't make your software open source. There are other licenses you can use, by the way. One of the things I want to make sure you guys understand is that these are the requirements to be open source. It's not requirements on what you can do with your software. There are 4 more. 7 is probably the only one that's really all that important here. But what 7 says is that if I give you my code and it's licensed some way, anyone you give that code to has access to the same license, right? You can't, or I can't make it so that if I give you the license and then you give somebody else, they have to come back to me and pay a fee or get my permission or anything like that, right? It can be passed on from one to another. The other ones are not really so interesting, and I'm just going to avoid them for now, unless you guys have any questions. But they're just basically about how you distribute it and how you can affect other software and so on. All right. Any questions on that so far? All right, so now, at this point, having completely exhausted everybody and put you to sleep, we're going to introduce AI. Isn't that fun? So, this is my abstract on the left, and as they released version 1 of the OS AI, here's reality. They actually did a validation. It's not a formal approval of anything. It's not anything that has any impact. But what the OSI wanted to do, and by the way, the open source AI discussion is started and maintained by the open source initiative OSI, headquartered in, I think, Oregon, but with a home office in this area. They looked at some stuff. So I want to point out a couple of things. So if you look at things like TensorFlow and PyTorch, right? Are you guys familiar with TensorFlow and PyTorch? Right, they allow you, they're Python modules that allow you to build AI systems, essentially, right? Those are licensed, not to get this backwards. TensorFlow, I believe, is Apache, which is a permissive license. PyTorch is licensed BSD 3 clause, although you have to read it an awful long way in their license file to get there. but it's BSD 3 clause, which is a even more permissive license if possible. So they're both licensed open source pretty standardly. They're also only code, right? You can build an application out of them that becomes an AI application, but they themselves are only code and modules in Python that you can use to build that. So they're not delivering an AI. So they absolutely fall under open source designations. Grok 1, the first iteration of X's AI, and also as of August 5th, I just caught that when I was Googling around. Otherwise, they wouldn't have made it in at all. GPT OSS, this is ChatGPT instances, GPT OSS 120B and GPT OSS 20B. Also say that they're licensed under the Apache license. But if we look over on the right, what we see is that there are a couple of engines that are open source according to OSI, and then there's some that could be, and then the only one of that list that shows up is Grok. And the reason Grok, the other ones, the GPT ones, aren't there is because despite having the name OpenAI, OpenAI hasn't been open for a very long time. I think they were initially, and they backed off that really quickly, and they haven't been open for years. Now they're making the same claims as Grok. So let's take a quick look at that, I think. This is the main link for Grok, and it goes to a place called Hugging Face, and we can look at the files and versions, and what we find out is that we go into this directory here. The only thing that's there is actually all sorts of tensors, and these tensors are actually weights of a neural network, right? So these are the actual weights that go into your program. And if we go back and look here, we can see that those weights are licensed Apache 2.0. Apache 2.0 is, in fact, an open source license, and we have a bunch of numbers that are now licensed open source that if we want to dig into, we can actually see. If we want to look at the code itself, we can go to the GitHub repository where the code is stored, and we can see that that is also licensed. Where is that? Here we go. Also licensed Apache, but it is exceedingly small, right? This is an empty directory. Everything else is contained in that directory. There are some files, some Python files, some README files, some checkpoint files. That's it. If you want to make a Grok instance, and by the way, I checked this out for at least the 120B from ChatGPT. I didn't bother going to the 20B because I don't see why they would have changed, right? So if this is the same thing with the OpenAI releases. What they're giving you is they're giving you the code that runs the engine, in some sense, and the weights that get applied. So you can stand up one of these AI instances, and you can make it do things, and you can even play with the weights. But that's just like playing with the binary code, right? And probably even less so because there's no logical flow that this binary code applies to. It's weights in an AI model, right? That's all you're getting. So the OSI looked back, and actually a lot of people looked back, and they said, does this actually meet the needs that we wanted in those initial, right, 4 freedoms or 10 principles, right? And it's no, because there's no effective way to modify these things. Even though everything they give you is open source and technically you can modify anything, the ability to understand and innovate on it is minimal at best, okay? You can do some black box testing, you can change some of the weights and run some experiments, but overall you're not going to get very far. There was a promise to make Grok 2 open source. I don't know if we're past that promise yet or not, but if we go down there, what we find out is that Grok 2 is licensed under the Grok community license, and there are all sorts of clauses in there that are not open source. So Grok 2, even though it's not any more expressive in what they're providing you, also can't be used for commercial use, unless you have all these guardrails. So this is not an open source license. Open source licenses are generally approved by OSI. They don't, an unapproved license can be open source, but they've looked at this one and they don't believe this is even close. All right. So now we got to start thinking, what does it mean to have an open source AI? Right? These guys did everything they were supposed to do. Right? They made, and by the way, Grok 1 was released 9 months before the OSI put this whole thing out. So, they can maybe be a little bit forgiven for not anticipating ahead of time what was going to be approved or even caring. So, people started thinking, what would we need to do? What would we need to change to be able to introspect and understand how an AI model is working, right? And it all comes back to data at that point, right? So if you start thinking about it, and this is, by the way, this is from the first release candidate on October 9th, because there was a whole lot of commentary that went out with it. And it was really fun, if you happen to be into this area, it was really fun to read, because they're generally polite, but they're not necessarily nice. There's a difference. So, first note, what is data information, right? And they tell you up front that this is the new language of data information, and what we have to do is we have to recognize 4 types of data. This is a controversial one from my standpoint, but I understand why they're doing it. But 4 types of data. Open data, data that you own copyright to. So if you have open data and you're claiming an open AI model, then that open data is problem-free, right? You can give that to anybody. The second one is public data. Not quite the same thing. You don't own copyright, so you may not be able to transmit it, but somebody else can get it from the same public, right? The third one is obtainable data, and obtainable means money, or at least filling out a form. NIH, for example, I don't know whether this falls under public or obtainable, but for the NIH, they have a huge database of lung cancer instances. So if you're doing studies on lung cancer, you can actually get enormous data dumps of CT and X-rays of diseased and undiseased cancer-free lungs. There's no fee for it, but you do have to apply, and you do have to have patience because it downloads very slowly, and you do have to have a very big disk. Okay? So that falls into either the public or obtainable. I think it's obtainable. And then there's something called unshareable data. And this is where the problem is. Unshareable data is data that they use to train their model that they're not going to give you, and you have no way to get. Okay? And the problem is, well, we'll get into the problems of that. Yes, we will get into the problems of that. And the legal requirements are different from each. The only one that you can actually distribute as part of your open source code is the one for which you hold copyright, right? Unless somebody else has licensed the data and allowed you to have it from the public. This basically just says that, okay, data is one thing, but have any of you done an open source project and had to fight through public data? No? Curation of your data takes more time than anything else you're going to do, right? You're taking data from multiple sources, you're trying to make it look the same, and you're going to provide to your system that data in a form that it can use, right? That's going to take you longer than anything else. So RC1 clarifies that the code has to be complete enough for downstream recipients to understand how the training was done, including the curation. But they also have to explain, did they do a leave one out training? How did they go about the training? How many epochs did they run? How many iterations did they run? All of that becomes important. This is one I don't like. This is a claim that says that open source software never had its goal of being reproducible. Now, I worked for a number of companies. That was not a goal. If the software wasn't reproducible, then how did you know you had it installed correctly, right? So the whole idea is before you can modify something, you get it working the same way it worked for the other guy. So I'm not really a big fan of this one, but there's a reason why they put this compromise in there. What I don't like is that they're claiming that it was never, even an unstated goal that things be reproducible. What they're basically saying here is that we never guaranteed that open source software would work the same for different people. And that's true because that's how you discover bugs, but that's because they were bugs, right? But that's one of the clauses that I wasn't really happy about. Okay, so those are the things we're going to be looking for as we kind of go through the rest of this. And we're getting close to where we want to be. I don't know why everybody keeps reinventing stuff, but we have the 4 freedoms, we have the 10 principles, and now we have the 4 principles, I don't know, whatever they're calling it here, for open source AI. And you'll notice, as we go through, that they are really close to the 4 freedoms, but just different enough that they're not. So freedom 0 is run the program as you wish for any purpose. Well, that's the same as open source AI freedom 1. Use the system for any purpose and without having to ask for permission. Freedom 1 of the free software, study how the program works. Freedom 2, study how the program works and inspect its components. The difference here is that this doesn't actually say you can change, this doesn't actually say you can change it. They move that down to 3. But, if you combine 2 and 3, you get freedom 1, and then there were 2 clauses for redistribute in the free software freedoms, and they just said you can share it modified or unmodified. So these cover exactly the same ground, but we had to reinvent something, right? We couldn't say we're just going to use them and tweak it a little bit so that they applied to AI. This last paragraph, the important thing here is a precondition to exercising these freedoms is having access to the preferred form to make modifications. That was the same in the 4 freedoms. You need access to the preferred form. The preferred form is not modifying weights ad hoc to get the output to change, right? The preferred form is to have the data so that you can look at and change what you consider truth, right? If you're looking for, or if you're trying to understand the system and you want to look for bias, right, you can't do that from the weights. All you can do that from is from the data itself. If you want to know, most of these engines are really simple. There's no coding bias in them, right? In general, an AI system is completely amoral, right? There's no left, right, center, anything there. Any biases that come in on the data and how you curate that data and what you consider to be the correct answer, right? So if you're not having access to that fundamental data, you're not actually able to make the decision whether there's a bias or not. I mean, if the data says something, even if we don't like it, it's what the data says, right? But if you weight it and cherry pick and change what you consider true and false, then that's where where any bias is going to come in, whatever side you're on. So you need to be able to see the data. But we talked about the fact that we have multiple types of data, and the people who develop the AI only have the legal right to distribute one of those to you, right? The only thing they can distribute is the one for which they hold the copyright, in general. Public data, sometimes they can. So that comes to this data information paragraph, right? So the OSI, and actually I talk about this at the end a little bit if we have time, we'll see. But this was a worldwide effort. So the OSI opened up this deliberations to everybody, and you were able to participate in the deliberations. And what they're trying to find out is they're trying to find a compromise. Because nobody wants to limit our AIs to only using public data, right? If we do that, then we're really handicapping our, or public or owned data. we're really handicapping ourselves, right? Then non-open source solutions are always going to be better because they have access to more data, or at least have the potential to be better. So we don't want to just limit ourselves to that. What we want to be able to do is we want to be able to take in all this data and find a way to make the playing field even and describe our data in sufficient detail that we can actually make decisions on it. And I'm going to suggest that this is not a perfect compromise, but what they're saying is you have to have for all the data, including the data that you can't give or that somebody can't actually get, you have to have this data information. And it has to include a complete description of all the data. It has to including any of the unshareable data. We need to know what it is. You need to characterize it, in a way that's within the bounds of legality. For example, personal identifying information can't be disclosed, but you have to describe it so that we know what it is, so that we can get similar data, or at least know what kind of decisions you're making. And after that, you need, all of the data you're going to provide. You need a listing of all the publicly available training data and where to get it. So you can't just say, LIDC for lung cancer data. Tell them the link, right? And then a listing of all the training data obtainable from third parties and where to get it, even if you gotta pay. And you're not required to pay, right? If I'm taking somebody's open source code and I don't want to pay for the third-party data, I don't actually have to pay it. It's just telling me where they got it from. And that's the interesting part, because that kind of fills in that gap. Now, there's problems with that, and we'll talk about those in a couple more slides, but that's basically the crux of the problem. That's what separates Grok 1 from being really useful, right? If we had that information for Grok 1, then we could introspect into it, and we could figure out what's actually going on there. The code is easy, right? Well, mostly. The code for the engine is easy. The weights are easy. You have to provide both of those. But if you're using code to train and run the system, right, you have training shell files or whatever, you have to provide that. You have to provide code for processing and filtering the data, right? Necessary if you want to look at bias and you don't have access to the data, at least you have access to the filters that were used, right? Anything you did with validation and testing, any support libraries, like you're tokenizing your input so that, in a specific way, basically giving the people the ability to go from your raw data, such of it as they've been able to obtain or are willing to pay for, to the input data that you use to your system. And then tokenizers and hyperparameters and search code and inference code and model architecture. That all becomes part of what needs to be put out. So it's a little bit more, Grok certainly didn't give us any of the data curation stuff. They didn't give us any of the data. That would have to be added. And doing that would probably help out a lot. And then, parameters. Any parameters you used, learning rates or anything like that. Checkpoints, if you ran for a while and then checkpointed it, that'll allow somebody else to get to the checkpoint and validate that they at least are getting somewhat close. Okay. And this just says it doesn't matter what your AI model is. If it's an AI model or a neural net, it all has to be made as available as possible. Another drawback of the open source AI definition, there's not really any legal mechanism right now for, well, there's never, right, this isn't a legal mechanism for the open source side, but they haven't figured out how to make model parameters completely available. They're going to kind of play it by ear for a little bit and figure it out. And I expect that'll come as we start taking this open source AI definition and developing actual licenses from it. Because as far as I know, there's no license right now. And you can see various of the components being licensed in different ways in order for you to get there, right? Certainly, the Apache that's being used for both the weights and the code for Grok and GPT engines, right? That's perfectly valid. It just doesn't go far enough, all right? Okay. At this point, that's kind of what I wanted to talk to you about. I did forget to say one thing. When we're talking about open and free, they are two camps, but it's not like a warring camp. Everything that's free is also open, and almost everything that's open is also free. And they all have the same goal in mind. It's just two different ways of approaching the same open source thing. And that's just something I didn't want to slander anybody in the talk. I'm a big fan of both. There's other reading here. Let's see, we are at 5:35. I think I want to go through a couple of these, but I'm not going to go through too much more. We'll open it up for any questions you guys may have. But what I wanted to do was the next couple of slides are part of what I'm calling the other reading list. And this was the part that is kind of interesting because these are the people that were actually commenting on the system. This particular one was a conference in Latin America where they were presenting, I think, just before this was released, they were presenting it and getting feedback from people. And basically, Mayor Joyce, she was talking about how important it was to get people from different countries and different regions of the world involved because these things have to span the world if we want them to be useful. So, for example, in Japan and in the EU, one of the reasons that we have such a problem with data is they've passed specific laws that allow companies doing AI training to get access to personal data on lots of government platforms. It's illegal to redistribute that. It's illegal to give any, to push that back out. But to train on it is legal, right? So that has to be encapsulated, or it has to be captured. Even data that is under law protected can be used to train an AI. So that was one of her things. And also, she mentions the idea of open washing. Technically, what Grok and GPT are doing by calling their stuff open source is open washing. They're claiming something without actually meeting the requirements. It's just like, any other washing, I guess. You make your non-compliant stuff look compliant just by saying the right words. This was an article on the need to be flexible on data, and this kind of encapsulated a lot of what they were talking about. And here's the mention of the EU, Japan, and Singapore. So this guy is bothered by the definition of the open source data. He wants more data to be available, but he's supporting the compromise because how do you bring in this data that is not legally allowed to be disclosed, but is legally allowed to be used in training to actually, you either have to exclude it from any open source AI engine, or you have to describe it the best you can and hope that people can figure out what it is you did. This guy had the same complaint. I didn't see this till after I made the complaint. I was cleaning up afterwards. This kind of made me feel good. This guy has the same complaint about reproducibility. He says we went from, if we have a scale of 0 to 10 on reproducibility, originally what we were talking about was, similarity of about 8 or 9, maybe 10. And now, with the words you're using, it's down to about 6 or 7. So he's concerned, right? If you don't have all the data, you can't recreate the system, right? So unless you're willing to spend the time and the money to get all the data, you can't do it. So that's kind of an interesting thing for me. And then here's the last one. Are we compromising open source ideals? Similar topic. Some people believe that full unfettered access, and I got to tell you, that's kind of where I fall at sometimes. I think maybe you at least need an exemplar AI where all of the data can be disclosed, right? Because then at least you could use all their procedures, all of their filters, everything, generate an AI, and you could test it to see whether it's 9 or 10 similar to the existing AI. And then you could go forward with more confidence that you have a working system and what you're doing is modifying the system and not just randomly making garbage. When I've taught an open source resources course, we do a little AI exercise. It's one of our modules. And you know, if you miss any of the curation steps, you don't rescale your data between 0 and 256. It looks at images of fashion items. If you don't rescale your data between 0 and 256, you get garbage, right? If you don't make it 8 by 8 or 256 by 256, I think it's 256 by 256, 8-bit, you get garbage, right? And it doesn't matter what you do after that, you've already messed everything else up. So, you know, being able to test that and make sure that you're getting out something reasonable, something that the other guy came close to, is a really important part of reproducibility or of actually knowing that your software is open source and usable. All right, I'm going to stop there, unless you guys have no questions, in which case I'm going to quiz you. All right, anybody have any questions? Yeah. They were released, yeah. The ones that the guidelines and all the discussion was taken from the most recent document. I think that was the 29th of October. Some of the initial stuff was earlier than that, and all of these comments were between, ended at the 29th of October, but were active before then. So yeah, it's relatively not as new as it was last year, but still pretty new. I don't think there's been a lot of discussions on this yet. Any other questions? Yeah.
So on your open source software discussion earlier, you talked about not being able to charge because you distribute software as one of the
No, not quite. You can charge. You can always charge anybody what they're willing to pay. What I can't do is give you software, and then when you give it to somebody else, they have to pay me. Okay? You can sell it for whatever you can get for it, but I can't require you to give me a kickback. Ah, got it, yeah. Kickbacks are cool, but unfortunately not allowed.
I have a question. So, especially this is for the medical field,
Mm-hmm.
because if you move patients from one state and the other state, it's a state boundary.
Yes, yeah.
And you play a model with one state patient data, can you use it across another state or even country?
So that's a really good question. It depends on the jurisdiction. So, sorry? Oh, yeah, I can repeat the question. So the question is, if you have a piece of data, particularly medical data, that was obtained in a specific geographical area like a state or a country, can you share it across other states or other jurisdictions, other countries? And that's actually it's a really interesting question. That falls under, so when you're going to use somebody's medical data in the United States, rules are different elsewhere. But if you're going to use somebody's medical information in the United States, there's a governing law called HIPAA, right? And you have to get, in order to release their data and use their data, you need to get informed consent. So how far that data can be distributed and who can use it is dependent upon the terms in the HIPAA agreement. So when they did, for example, the LIDC study and there was a big cancer study up through about 2010 or something like that. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the. When they did that, the HIPAA, or the informed consent form, told them it was going to go into a public repository that anybody had access to and could be distributed. I think it was worldwide, but it may have been just within the United States. So it does depend on the terms you've disclosed to people. And if you want to use it for something else, then you have to get them to re-up or sign up for the other thing.
Yeah, even after you get the consent
Mm-hmm.
of the patients and also meet all of the HIPAA compliance,
Mm-hmm.
there is still, I think, country restrictions.
There,
Sometimes we cannot use it in other countries unless
yeah, I'm not, yeah. I know that there was one big data set. So the comment was that he knows that there are country restrictions, and I'm absolutely on board with that. I can definitely believe that. But there are times when you get around that. Like there were two bodies that willed themselves to science that were used by the NIH to do the visible human studies. And that data was published widely, and they actually made some volumes of illustrated books. If you want to see something really gross and cool at the same time, look for the visible human out of the NIH. The data is publicly available. I think the data is definitely available in the US. The book is available worldwide. Yes?
What's your opinion on like countries having laws where companies can use data that's not like published, that they're not allowed to distribute publicly?
I think it makes things complicated. So I'm of two minds of this, and I don't mean, so the question was, was my opinion on countries making data available but not allowing it to be public? Is that essentially the restatement? So I tend, when I'm asked to make my certain types of data, not my home address and phone number and everything like that all available, but when I'm asked to make, like 23andMe or whatever, that data, my data public, I generally say yes, because it may be a dumb thing, but I'm kind of on that whole. I've done enough research that I know how hard it is to get good data, and I like to be part of, I trust enough in the anonymization and stuff that I like to be part of that. But I'm not sure that I agree with just letting AI operators harvest that data without the ability to make it public, simply because I'm not sure they should be allowed to harvest it without this buy-in. And that's a difficult thing to say because really, the more data you have, the better decisions you can make. There's always a selection bias when you have to have people agree to join a study, right? The people that agree to join the study happen to have a certain demographic often, or a set of common characteristics. And you exclude people that don't share, that have more of a mistrust of government, more of a mistrust of AI. So, I don't think it's a perfect system. I don't know that I would have made that choice, but I'm willing to let companies or countries make the decision that best reflects their population desires. That's not I'm kind of a live and let live kind of guy, which, by the way, I want to throw out. We talked a lot about open source stuff. We talked about open source licenses, and I said this is definitely not an open source license. That in no means that you can't use it. It just means you can't use it and claim it to be open source, right? You have the right to do with your art what you want to do with it, right? I'm in favor of making it open source because that allows us to share broadly, everyone under the same umbrella. You know what you can use, you know how you can use it. But if you want to, put in other clauses, that's fine. You just got to, call it something else, which is fine. Yeah.
Actually, a bit more on this. I see the silver bullet to all these sort of AI privacy cases to be like some kind of large, curated, highly vetted data set that is giving the approval of it, not the people, but some large body of relevant experts. And if this large data set is kind of distributed to companies, startups, and so forth to train them on this and produce their models and capitalize however they like to. How feasible is the production of such a data set, and would that even be appropriate?
So,
Given that you're now narrowing our scope of the data that would be in that data set.
yeah, so let me restate your question, and then you tell me if I got it right. So the question is there a way to have a public good kind of law that allows us to aggregate all this data, and how feasible is it to gather this data, make it publicly available, and allow any company access to it? Is that essentially? And to vet upon it. So I remember the name of the study that I was talking about. The NLST study was the biggest study on CT and X-ray data for lung cancer. They determined the lung cancer screening protocols. They determined that they could save a lot of lives by doing proactive CT on vulnerable populations. And that took about 10 years and a lot of money, and all they did was collect CT exams. And the technology changed so much from the start of the study to the end of the study that the data at the front end had to be completely managed differently than the data at the back end. The good thing of the study was it was terminated early because as the CTs got better and better, the answer became obvious, right? So it was actually terminated early. The thing that comes up is that what you're competing with is you're competing with Google. And what people won't voluntarily give up to a government entity, they will voluntarily get up to get their shipment next day, right? So it depends on, it depends on what data you're looking at. We've done this. The NLST is a great example of that, the lung cancer study. There are studies on, smaller studies on colon cancer and other things. So we can do that. It's generally for a targeted problem, high payoff, where getting people to where the commercial interests can't make enough money off it to make it worthwhile for them to collect it. I mean, that's really where this explosion of data has come from, is web browsers. So a lot of things were enabled. If you look at the timeline of when all of this AI stuff took off, it was after Google and Facebook and X, Twitter, and Instagram became big enough that there was an effective pool of people that you could actually mine, right? Everybody belongs. We can get information from everybody. And it's not self-selecting in the same way that people that participate in government studies are. So it's a good idea. We've used it in targeted instances. It's really powerful when we can do it. It costs a lot. If we can let somebody else do it for us, and because they're getting paid targeting ads, I don't know. Less satisfying, but yeah. Anything else?
I do have one.
Yes, please. Yeah.
I work in the medical field, and
Oh, awesome.
there are a lot of these foundation models that
Yes.
is open source, like from Amazon or from Google and so on. We could use those. They're all pre-trained models.
Yep.
Is there any licensing restriction on those? Because even though they are open source,
There we go. So I'd have to look at the specifics, but if you look up here, if you're using T5 from Google, no. I mean, I would look at the licensing terms of the specific licenses that they're using, but they fall by the OSI has already said they're good. I would read it carefully because it may be that you have to release things in a specific way, but that would be any derivative code may have to be released under the same license, but you can always use the results from it. Although that does bring up another interesting thing on the output from AI models. If you were trained on licensed code, like a lot of the Copilot and other code engines, they've been trained on code, largely code that was uploaded to GitHub. Most of that code is probably GPL. So you start running into issues. The longer the code segment you get, the more likely you are to be infringing somebody else's GPL license unknowingly. And there's was a lot of noise about that when Copilot first came out. It seems to have quieted down a little bit now. I haven't heard anything recently, but there's a lot of people upset about how the training used GPL licensed code. There's a free use clause. Small snippets are always free use. So, small enough, it's okay. But at what level of complexity does it all of a sudden cross that line? And now you have to start putting the GPL license on it because you were trained on GPL code. So there is that. Yes? So that's an interesting one. You own your own personal data. If you give it to, so the question was, who owns the data that's being scraped or that's being obtained? And I don't have a great answer for this, okay, but I'm going to give you the answer that I have. You own your own personal data. You can let other people use it by signing, a release form, essentially, or by voluntarily giving it up as part of a transaction, right? And then you're bound by the terms and conditions of, for example, Amazon. Whatever they say you have to do, if you ever read those things when you're signing up for stuff, they have to tell you what they're going to do with their data. At least in the United States. I don't know about other countries so much. So you own it. You may have signed an agreement that lets somebody else use it, and then whoever has that can use it to the extent that they've made to you in the terms of use of their website or whatever. For things like the NLST study, the people own their data, but they signed over rights to their data, to use their data, a specific use of their data to the government for the study. So they still own their data. You can always go to your doctor. Doctors don't like this, but you can always go to your doctor and request your own data. And they have to give it to you because you actually own it. And you can require that they not distribute it, and you can, I think, actually tell them they have to remove it, both of which is not good for your health necessarily, right? You want any doctor you go to know what's wrong with you in general, but you can do that on a case-by-case basis. So, in general, in the United States, you own your data, but you license it to other people by either implicitly or explicitly accepting terms of use and making your data public. Does that help? Yeah. Yeah. You are a valuable commodity, right? People want you because, you're going to graduate. Maybe you already graduated. You're going to make some money. You're going to spend some money. They want access to that money. So you are a valuable target. People like you, at least on the internet. Marketers. Okay. Anything else?
I have a
Yeah,
question.
please.
So we're talking about all these AI models, LLM models, which are out there in public, and whatever we enter the data, they are being used somehow without our consent, or maybe we have written in the fine print by accessing the terms and conditions.
Yeah.
And I hear about some LLM models that you can run locally, and how secure they are. Like, for example, now the DeepSeek that came in, they said that you can run your LLM locally, or the Llama models, anything you can run locally in a contained environment without sharing the data. Are those still considered as open source, or?
Yeah, open source applies at the time of distribution. So if you create something and you never give it to anybody else, then it's neither open nor closed, it's yours. If you distribute it and you meet the criteria for other people being able to do the open sourcey things with it, then it's open source. So anything that's local is neither open nor closed, it's just yours.
So all the models that we use that and we try.
Right, unless you distribute them somehow, making them make access available to somebody else. Right, if you make access available and you give them all of the open source tools, all the components that you use to generate your data, then it's open. If you give it to them and you say you can just use it, then it's closed. Okay? The terms only apply on distribution, on giving it to somebody else. Okay? Oh, by the way, just on the data question, if somebody derives data from your data, they own the derived data. Right, so if I generate a bunch of statistics that say, X number of students in my class got, this question wrong or something, that's okay. It can't be a class of 2, right? It has to be enough statistical power there that you can't identify anybody. But I think that's okay. Yeah?
Have you
Because the copyright for the works generated by the machine, well, so if I'm the one that developed the data, I own the copyright, right? If I develop the machine and get the data, get the results out, then a case could be made. The AI doesn't own the copyright, but I believe that I do. I'm not sure about this. This is a fuzzy area. But when we're talking about the ChatGPT stuff or the Copilot stuff, the problem is that the people that wrote the code that was used to train it actually have a copyright on the code they wrote. And if the chunks of output being spit out by Copilot, for example, are big enough, then you start having to see, is Copilot, are they following the rules? They've already given you the ability to look at it, right? That was the GPL license gave people the ability to look at that code, right? But anything that's derived from it, it's either a derivative or it is exactly the same code spit out after throwing it through a translation machine, right? So then you would have, you would still own, it's a matter of who actually owns that copyright. The machine can't, so far. We'll see where we get to. I think it's going to be a matter of, if we get to the point where there's novel synthesis, I think we may have to revisit this again, but I don't know what we do at that point. Yeah?
But at least for any code that is generated by an AI is owned not by the person generating it, but by Anthropic or OpenAI, Microsoft, or
Okay.
that's it?
That's the terms of use of that, right? I think that's written into the terms of use of OpenAI. I think. I'd have to look at it. But that's it's definitely an interesting point.
We can start the meeting. And I just wanted to thank you all for joining in, and I'm really sorry for the people who tuned in on WebEx. We were not able to properly set up everything. We had last minute technical issues. But next time we'll try to, as we are planning to have a talk for everyone.
On Discord,
And I want to thank
Discord QR code if you could also put that up in the screen.
a lot of people have so many are really confused about all the AI things right now, what is happening, and anything that is open doesn't mean open source. That's one thing. And yeah, I want to thank our IEEE members here. Michael Turner is a close friend of Professor Wes Turner, and you guys can hang out networking with all the other industry professionals we have here. And I would like to call upon our chair, Lalit Mehta, who wants to say a few words about our IEEE and the vision of IEEE. Thank you.
Professor Wesley, thank you very
Well,
much.
thank you very much. I put your QR code, I assume.
Yeah, that's for the IEEE Discord. I appreciate y'all showing up. If you don't mind, we do technical lectures like this with our student branch. So I'm Ferris, I'm the chair of the student branch. And we'll also be doing a couple other events this month, with the next one being on September 16th for Career Fair Prep. If any of y'all are looking to go to the career fair, how to build a resume, how to develop an elevator pitch, and then we'll also be doing mock career fair with one of the companies that will be there. So, join the Discord to keep up to date with our events. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, actually, the open source will be a big problem, especially the licensing if you make a lot of money. If you don't make money, I don't think that will be a problem.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
And IEEE is a great organization. I joined IEEE over 40 years ago. I'm a